મને લાગે છે આપણે ખુતબામાં આ બી યુઝ કરશું સાથે.
મને મનાય ભાવે
આ માઇક નથી તો
શાયદ મને બેઠાલી કીધા બેઠાલી આ મોટું બાપુ મને પ્રોબ્લેમ નથી
એ આપશે ઓલો
હજી કેરા નથી પણ એ કીધા કે આ બે સાથે નહીં વાપરવું
ટ્રાય કરશો આ એક જ પછી જો ધેનો બેટર
ચોખ્ખું કીધા બે નહીં વાપરવું sorry.
No problem. They are doing their job. No problem at all.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين عليا ولي الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد انتجبه لولايته واختصه بالرسالة وأكرمه بالنبوة وأشهد أن عليا ولي الله أمينه في أرضه وحجته على عباده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أوصيكم عباد الله وإياي بتقوى الله. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I take the opportunity to remind myself the importance of taqwa, a concept which has been mentioned throughout the Holy Quran in multiple different occasions, and to of course admonish you in the importance of adhering to the precepts and the disciplines of taqwa. When you refer to the khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam, it's amazing in how he breaks down what exactly it means to be a person who is God-fearing, a person who is conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran very vaguely presents to us the notion, have taqwa. But what does it mean to have taqwa? Here the Imam alayhi salam in this beautiful narration, in the sermon, breaks down and presents over 100 different characteristics. Last week we began the discussion with the first characteristic. He says, "Man taqahumus sawab." Those who are God-fearing, their speech is always inclined towards the truth. Secondly, he says, وَمَلْبَسُهُمْ الْإِقْتِصَادِ. In terms of their clothing, they are moderate in how they present themselves in public, especially specifically in the terms, in the way they dress, in the way they present themselves. Now, very interesting, when you look at this idea of clothing, libas, malbasahum, libas, within the Holy Quran, Allah uses this word sometimes literally, referring to physical clothing that you and I wear, but then many a times he uses the word libas figuratively. And likewise, when you look at the sermon of the Imam alayhi salam, huwa Quranun natiq, isn't it? Yes, that he is the speaking Quran. Scholars, what they've done is they've approached his words and they've also interpreted his words not literally, but also figuratively. And I'll share some of the opinions that has been proposed to us. So when you look at the literal meaning that the Imam is speaking of, he says that they are moderate in how they spend in their clothing. They don't spend too much, especially when they buy clothes. When it comes to fashion, unfortunately, you'll find that society presents an idea that value comes from the clothes that you wear. And others believe or are made to believe that their sense of value comes from buying the most expensive of clothes. Here the Imam goes back to the fundamental rudimentary value that you as a human being, your value does not come from your physical apparent nature. The value as a human being comes from within. Never feel obliged to follow the standards that have been created by society. And what's interesting is that when you actually read the sermon, many of the qualities that the Imam begins to outline for us as to what it means to be a muttaqi, all of it, most of it at least, majority of it is common sense. If a person has embedded within his lifestyle good akhlaq, naturally all of the guidance that the Imam outlines for us, it's very easy to mold within our lifestyle. It's a shame to see people who are in a position where they cannot afford to buy, the great brand names or the the big brand names, but then they would go out of their way to buy such attire. It's a shame to see that there are people who have the resources and the wealth to buy such clothing and such brands, but they do so with the intention to show others what they can afford. And it's a greater shame to see that people judge others based on the clothing that they wear. And with it, the respect and the disrespect that comes as well. When you look at the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a very interesting verse, very, very interesting verse. It says, Ya bani Adam, قَدْ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ لِبَاسًا. We have sent down clothing for you. When he speaks about the Quran, he says, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَادِرِ, for example. The same language is used. قَدْ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ لِبَاسًا. We have sent down, we have brought down clothing for you. What does that mean? What, that clothing came from the heavens, Allah opened up the skies and He gave clothing to us? This verse is in reference to the blessing that Allah has given us. So all of a sudden, something such mundane that we hardly think about, clothing, is seen as a form of blessing. And it highlights our weakness as human beings, but it also highlights the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the Mufassirin, when it comes to this particular ayah, they say that when you look at the root of clothing, how is clothing manufactured? From the raw materials. How do these raw materials grow? From rain. Allah, through this intricate system, has allowed materials to grow from the earth, which we have utilized using our skill, which He has given us, using the materials that He has provided for us to make and beautify ourselves with the clothing that we wear. So all of a sudden, this blessing, the root of this blessing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see, the system that Allah has created, every single thing in our lives, everything can be stemmed from Allah and the power that He has shared with us as well. قَدْ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ لِبَاسًا. We have revealed, or we have sent down for you clothing. What's the reason behind clothing? يُوَارِي سَوْآتِكُمْ وَرِيشًا. So that you preserve two things. Number one, you protect your private parts. There are certain parts of the human body which should not be exposed to anyone else. The first function of clothing is so that it covers our body, it enables modesty within our lives, and secondly, warisha. Your risha, the word risha in the original Arabic is in reference to the wings of a bird. When you look at the wings of the bird and how it's filled with feathers, number one, it acts as a protection for them. Number two, it's a form of beautification for them as well. So the clothing that you and I wear is a form of adornment for us. So there are two fundamental characteristics of clothing that Allah is highlighting here. Number one, it should not expose certain body parts to the general public. And number two, it is a form of adornment for you, a form of beautification for you. Beyond this, the Imam is not just saying that they are moderate in the way they spend in terms of the clothes that they buy, but generally in their lifestyle. They are moderate in their mentality. They are not extravagant and they do not overspend. There's a very interesting concept that was presented. And the scholars said that when you look at a person who is a muttaqi, never in his life will he fall into the traps of poverty. Poverty is a very interesting discussion. Sometimes poverty is enforced on us because of external circumstances, because of, for example, policies, war, and all of these things. This is not something that we can control in our hands. So there are external factors which drive us into poverty. But sometimes we have the resources to live a comfortable life. And the way we misspend and abuse our resources, that pushes us into poverty. The Imam alayhi salam is saying that the muttaqi, he knows he has these resources in his hands. He knows that this person can be comfortable and he will make sure that he is comfortable. He does not overspend. He is moderate in the way he spends his resources. Beyond this, There's a very interesting verse again in the Holy Quran. وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. Now, Allah is beginning to identify the role of clothing from a figurative perspective. Taqwa is a form of clothing. A person who is considered to be a muttaqi, it's as if he has clothed himself with the clothes of spirituality. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He speaks about taqwa, and I mentioned this in the introduction of the whole sermon itself, taqwa has two fundamental factors. There are two sides of it. The first is where a person acquires good deeds. He develops a good quality in his life. But from a different perspective, he guards himself and he creates a barrier. He creates boundaries. And it's necessary that as human beings, we create boundaries within our social circles. And people have to respect such boundaries. We create boundaries where we do not fall into sin or anything that causes the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The way clothing protects us from different harms. Taqwa and the clothing of taqwa protects us from all of that which pulls us towards the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's another verse in the Holy Quran. هُنَّ لِبَاسٌ لَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ لِبَاسٌ لَهُنْ. Usually we hear this verse when it's time for marriage or non-paraitiyare. Marriage, Allah highlights that the husband is a clothing for the wife and the wife is a clothing for the husband. What does that mean? It means that, in a marriage, you get to understand the ugliness and the faults of your partner, the deficiencies of your partner. But there is a fundamental respect that is there in that relationship that it should not be disclosed to the general public. What happens in the house stays in the house. That level of privacy is fundamental in a community as well. هُنَّ لِبَاسٌ لَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ لِبَاسٌ لَهُنْ. You protect her and she protects you. Likewise, there is a protection from sexual dangers. This is all something that has to be facilitated between the husband and the wife, so that there are values which are embedded, that are nurtured within the household. When you look at the whole concept of clothing that has been presented by the Imam, by Allah through the Holy Quran, you realize that there are many different levels, many different facets to it. From a figurative speech, from a figurative perspective, it protects us, it nurtures us to become spiritual beings. From a literal perspective, it creates modesty in the way we live our lives. It helps us secure our resources so that we don't fall into poverty. This is what wisdom is. From a single statement, which is literally two words, you can derive multiple different faceted meanings from it. That's what wisdom is. Someone will say something so simple to you, and through it you can come and deliver many different interpretations to it. When you refer back to Makarim al-Akhlaq, Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, he says, Ya Allah, albisni zinat al-muttaqeen. Clothe me according to the clothes of the muttaqeen. It's embarrassing, it's sad, it's a shame to see that society functions where the point of glamour, a symbol of wealth and prestige, is based on how people dress and how they present themselves in society. When the reality is what develops in the heart and how that professes through speech and actions is the true value of the human being. Always remember that the inner beauty of the human being is far more important than the outward apparent beauty that is presented by people in society. لِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. And the goal of those who develop themselves with the clothing of taqwa, it goes beyond more so in dunya, but even more so in akhirah. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the tawfiq to understand the wisdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, to nurture ourselves to be more spiritual individuals. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله قد جاء من عنده مصدقا للمرسلين خلف فينا راية الحق عليا وأولاده المعصومين حجج الله إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, when we look at what happened in the past week or so, the Scottish government or Parliament introduced a bill where young children from the age of 16 onwards can determine and discern which gender they want to belong to. Now, of course, the discussion is very, very sensitive and can be approached from a number of different perspectives. But allow me to just highlight one of these different perspectives. When you ask the question, what is the objective here? What is being achieved here? It's in line to what was introduced in the previous weeks, where we mentioned that society has a value and they will do whatever it takes to present these values to the general public. And that value is to maximize individual freedom so that people are able to maximize happiness. Now, this goes in opposition with the values presented by the religion of Islam. The religion of Islam, from the very get-go, tells us that to maximize happiness, one can never maximize happiness from the physical, apparent nature of things. Dunya, you will never be able to maximize happiness if your focus and your core focus is only on dunya and dunyawi perspective. Rather, it transcends beyond that which is material. Therefore, in the Holy Quran, Allah speaks about the world of the unseen, the spiritual nature, which also needs to be tapped into for a person to be able to maximize happiness. When you look at Hollywood, for example, in the media industry, there is a great emphasis to promote such values. And the reason for doing so is to normalize it. You see, in the beginning, when they introduce such concepts, there's a heavy backlash and there's great resistance from the general public. But then when there is consistency over a long period of time, naturally people become normal to it. People are normalized to it. And it becomes an accepted concept within society at large. Just very recently, there was a census done within the UK between the years 2021 and 2022, where they looked at the amount of population of those who belong to this LGBTQ demographic. They realized that it's a very small fraction of a percent of society at large. Literally less than 1 or 2% of people belong to such demographics. Yet, on the other hand, when you look at the politics, when you look at, for example, the lobbying, when you look at the media, it accommodates for that small, very, very small percentage. So again, it comes back to the fundamental question: what is the objective here? What's the vision that is being proposed here? From a fiqh perspective, many people raise this question: is it permissible to change one's gender? Is it halal or haram? There's another question that's often raised. A young girl, for example, who identifies to be a male, a boy, how does she pray? And vice versa. Does she pray like, for example, the boy prays, or does she pray the way women pray? So what's the fiqh perspective behind this? Sometimes we need to step back and understand what principles the religion of Islam presents to us and what other principles that society presents to us. When you can and are in a position where you're able to make a distinguishment between the principles of Islam and the principles of society, you wouldn't need to ask such questions and ask what is the answer from a fiqh perspective. So society as it stands has created a set of values which is reliant and very much dependent on the apparent nature of things. It's very much material oriented. Religion, on the other hand, tells us that values are not limited to the physical world, but they transcend the physical world. They are spiritual in nature. Hence the discussions of there being restrictions that has been proposed by the religion of Islam. Now, when you look at the values of society, it's as if the whole goalpost has changed, where you add new rules to the game so that it gives you an advantage. When you look at, for example, the values of what it means to be a human being, your identity, your responsibility, it comes from how you look rather than who you are from within. That's where the problem is. Changing the apparent way you look does not change who you are from the inside. And this is a common opposition, and it's a very valid argument that people are raising. 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now, if they were to dig up your bones in your grave, they could know for a fact that you are a male or a female based on the DNA that you have within your body. Even if you are the opposite gender or you presented yourself according to the other gender, according to your DNA in your bones, they would be able to identify that this person was a male or a female. Now, within such discussions, no one speaks about the irreparable and the irreversible damage that is caused from a person who transitions from one gender to another. Everyone promotes it. There is a great advocacy to it. But when it happens, no one speaks about the ramifications. You know, as human beings, we all tend to make decisions in life. And when we are young, we tend to make the worst of decisions. And if I were to ask you, for example, what were you up to at the age of 16 and 17? I mean, we have a whole list of things that we used to do. We learn. We make decisions, ad hoc basis, on the spur of the moment. We do the action, and then there is regret later on. We learn through experience. We learn when we mature. When we have children later on, we try and guard them from making the same mistakes that we do. Not consciously, but even on a subconscious level. I wouldn't want my son to make the same mistakes that I did. But when you look at this perspective, this whole scenario, this whole episode of what we're going through, you'll have a person who has made the decision to transition to a different gender, will go through the entire process, only to realize that it was a mistake that they made and they shouldn't have in the first place. Who is held accountable? Why is there no accountability from the different perspectives, from the different levels, from the policymakers to the physicians, to the counselors, to the psychologists, and so on and so forth? When a young girl chooses to be a boy, for example, and wants to change the gender, they go through certain life-changing operations. They're drugged up to modify their hormones. They go through hormone therapy. And then, of course, there are liberal attitudes towards fashion, only for them to realize that this was a major mistake that shouldn't have happened in the first place. You know, statistically, they say that a person who transitions to a different gender, to the other gender, within 7 or 10 years, they end up committing suicide. And this is according to American statistics. They realize that they are shunned by the majority, by society at large. Because remember, we're talking about a very, very small percentage of people who actually go through this. The majority, even though they advocate it, they still can't fully support what's happening. So they change, but then they are rejected by society. No one wants to have a relationship with them, because heterosexuals want to have a relationship with the opposite gender. They feel deformed because most of these surgeries, or at least some of these surgeries, are not successful. So they feel deformed. They have problems at work. They have social problems with their peers and colleagues. Work can be a toll on them. So this is again a mental baggage that they have to carry. They feel that they are not wanted in society. They feel lonely. A culmination of all of this, knowing that the damage is irreversible, leads them into committing suicide. When you look at, for example, the process itself, the drugs that are given to a young child who wishes to transition to a different gender, the puberty blockers as they're known as, these are delivered to children. And some of these drugs are used to castrate sexual predators and pedophiles. They are used to sterilize the young generation. You know, when you're young, you don't think about having children. When you mature, that natural instinctive nature of wanting children begins to settle in the heart. It's a natural disposition that Allah has given us, each and every single one of us. Once we hit a particular age, or at least a time in our lives, we wish to get married, we want more responsibilities, we wish to have a family, we wish to have children. A young child doesn't understand that because it hasn't reached that position in their lives yet. Yet they are made or they are sterilized from a very young age. This is criminal. Who is held accountable for this? From a different perspective, if parents are concerned for the safety of their children, they wish to help their children. And if a parent was to speak out against the whole process of transitioning from one gender to another, well, this in itself is slowly being criminalized. There have been cases in Vancouver where parents are spoken out against the physicians and different psychologists not allowing their children to transition, and they were criminally prosecuted. Again, there was a bill passed in Virginia in America where if parents do not affirm the gender of their children or do not affirm their children as transgenders, they can be criminally prosecuted. So that leverage, that authority that the father or the mother has, that is slowly being taken away by policymakers. Again, what about the doctors and the psychologists and the physicians and the professionals who are speaking out against this whole process? They essentially are whistleblowers. They are being shunned, blacklisted, their licenses are being removed, and they are being silenced. They are being demonized by society at large. No one wants to talk about the social problems. You'll hear, for example, headlines here and there, the social problems of the ramifications of the process and so on. Within sports, for example, we've seen many different cases in sports specifically, within prisons, within schools. It's absolute chaos. Now the Scottish Parliament has gone ahead and they have effectively eased the facilitation of the process entirely. They have made it easier. They have removed barriers. They have made it easier for children to transition and to identify themselves according to the other gender. Just as how, for example, very recently, the Spanish Parliament passed the same bill. They lowered the age from 18 to the age of 16. Now the problem of all of this is where the discussion becomes even more difficult, but even more interesting. The discussion that we've just had is based on the weakness of technology, right? The tech that we have in our hands is not sophisticated enough to allow all of this to work. But what if, for example, 500 years later, or even 50 years later, the technology is sophisticated enough to fully transition a male to a female and a female to a male, without there being any ramifications, significant ramifications? What if the tech allows a person to change their gender very easily and still be happy? What if the tech allows the process to be reversible? What happens then? Does it make it okay? Now, when you go back to the whole philosophy of the transgender movement, this is not something new that just popped up 20 years ago, 25 years ago. This is a movement that began during the Enlightenment period, over 250 years ago. And the fundamental concept behind the movement is significant when it comes to the discussions of gender roles. Gender roles are significant when you want to have the discussion of transgenderism. Gender roles are defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when you look at societies and civilizations that have come before, cultures and societies, they are to blame as to how they've treated women. More than that, they are to blame how they have used religion to commit the most heinous of crimes. But that doesn't justify that there is no discussion on gender roles anymore. Gender roles is still a very, very significant discussion to have. Within one's life, we cannot remove Allah from the way we live our lives. This is the entire perception of taqwa. Allah has to be part and parcel of our lives. It is Allah who has decided what gender I am. Once it has happened, there are responsibilities associated to that as well. When you look at society, society as a whole needs to function, and it functions best when there is a preservation of gender roles. When you look at families, succeeding families or successful families rely on family values. Family values rely and are dependent on gender roles. Transgenderism has a long history that obscures, dilutes the distinction between men and women and the role between men and women. They have re-engineered the values of what it means to be a male and a female in the name of individual freedom and equality. It's not all about maximizing happiness from the apparent nature of things. There has to be a discussion of the supernatural elements that is part and parcel of our lives. What has Allah decided for me, and what are my responsibilities based on that? We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of our time, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And to instill the values that were once instilled by his grandfather, Amir al-Mu'mineen. Allahumma salli ala abdik wa rasulik sayyid al-mursaleen wa rasuli rabbil alameen, Muhammadin al-Mustafa, sallallahu alayhi wa alih. وعلى أمير المؤمنين ووسي رسول رب العالمين علي المرتضى عليه السلام وعلى سيدة النساء العالمين وبدءة الخاتم النبيين فاطمة الزهراء عليه السلام وعلى سيد شباب أهل الجنة الحسن المجتبى والحسين سيد الشهداء عليهم السلام وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن قائم المنتظر المهدي. أرواحنا وأرواح العالمين له الفداء. اللهم افتح له فتحا يسيرا وانصره نصرا عزيزا. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. وآخر دعوان عن الحمد لله رب العالمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائمة قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله الحليم الكريم، لا إله إلا الله العلي العظيم. سبحان الله رب السماوات السبع ورب الأرضين السبع وما فيهن وما بينهن ورب العرش العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين ولو كره المشركون. لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين. لا إله إلا الله وحده أنجز وحده ونصر عبدا وعز جندا وهزم الأحزاب وحده. فله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير.
تسبيح فاطمة الزهراء سلامها.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
اللهم صل على محمد
محمد وآل محمد صلوات صل على محمد وآل. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بحق محمد وآل محمد. આપણા માঝે ભાઈઓ બહેનો બચ્ચાઓ બીમાર હોય આપણે દુઆ કરે કે અલ્લાહ લોકો બધાને શફા દે. ખાસ કરીને 2-3 મોમિન ભાઈ કેન્સરના મરીઝ છે. યા અલ્લાહ તું લોકોને શફા દે. બધાની તકલીફો દૂર થાય. આપણા આલિમો મરજા મોમિનીન ને મોમિનાત દુનિયામાં જ્યાં બી હોય યા અલ્લાહ તું લોકોને હિફ્ઝ અમાનમાં રાખ. અમારી બધી હાજતો પૂરી કર. અમારા ઇલ્મમાં વધારું કર. એવી દુઆ સાથે આપણે બધા સાથે 5 ફેરે અમ્મન યુજીબુ પડીએ. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. سورة فاتحة شفاء المرضى ودفع البلاء.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الحمد لله الأول قبل الإنشاء والإحياء، والآخر بعد فناء الأشياء، العليم الذي لا ينسى من ذكره ولا ينقص من شكره ولا يخيب من دعاه ولا يقطع رجاء من رجاه. اللهم إني أشهدك وكفى بك شهيدا، وأشهد جميع ملائكتك وسكان سماواتك وحملة عرشك ومن بعث من أنبيائك ورسلك وأنشأت من أصناف خلقك، أني أشهد أنك أنت الله لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك ولا عديل ولا خلف لقولك ولا تبديل، وأن محمدًا صلى الله عليه وآله عبدك ورسولك أدى ما حملته إلى العباد وجاهد في الله عز وجل حق الجهاد، وأنه بشر بما هو حق من الثواب وأنذر بما هو صدق من العقاب. اللهم ثبتني على دينك ما أحييتني، ولا تزغ قلبي بعد إذ هديتني، وهب لي من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. صل على محمد وآل محمد، واجعلني من أتباعه وشيعته، واحشرني في زمرته، ووفقني لآداء فرض الجمعات وما أوجبت علي فيها من الطاعات وقسمت لأهلها من العطاء في يوم الجزاء، إنك أنت العزيز الحكيم.
زيارة
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله، السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله، السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد الوصيين، السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولا يا ابن مولا، السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا سلطان يا أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا، كن شفيعنا وشفيع والدينا في يوم الجزاء. السلام عليك ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا حجة الله في أرضه، السلام عليك يا عين الله في خلقه، السلام عليك يا نور الله الذي يهتدي به المهتدون ويفرج به عن المؤمنين. السلام عليك أيها المحزح الخائف، السلام عليك أيها الولي الناصح، السلام عليك يا سفينة النجاة، السلام عليك يا عين الحياة، السلام عليك صلى الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك الطيبين الطاهرين. السلام عليك عجل الله لك ما وعدك من النصر وظهور الأمر. السلام عليك يا مولاي أنا مولاك. عارفون بأولئك وأخراك، أتقرب إلى الله تعالى بك وبآل بيتك، وأنتظر ظهورك وظهور الحق على يديك، وأسأل الله أن يصلي على محمد وآل محمد، وأن يجعلني من المنتظرين لك والتابعين والناصرين لك على أعدائك والمستشهدين بين يديك في جملة أوليائك. يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان، صلوات الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك. هذا يوم الجمعة وهو يومك المتوقع فيه ظهورك والفرج فيه للمؤمنين على يديك وقتل الكافرين بسيفك، وأنا يا مولاي فيه زيفك وجارك، وأنت يا مولاي قريم من أولاد الكرام ومأمور بالزيافة والإجارة، فأعزفني وأجرني. صلوات الله عليك وعلى أهل بيتك الطاهرين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل مسام وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزق توأم وتمتعه فيها طويلا.